On today's podcast, we will be touching on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Can they make a deep playoff run with Aaron Rodgers in his age 41 season? I'll touch on the recent news from the Browns coming out from Kevin Stefanski that they've decided to make Dillon Gabriel the QB2. Also, I'll touch on the new Trey Hendrickson news. The Bengals solved that situation. I personally think they solved it in the completely wrong way. I'll give my thoughts on that. And finally, we'll touch on the Cowboys, Micah Parsons, what Dak Prescott had to say. I'll give some more thoughts regarding what Jerry Jones had to say in his podcast with Michael Irving, which was very interesting. If you guys are new here, I've been putting out this podcast for about 2 years. We're about 5 episodes in through 2 years. I started, I stopped, and now I plan to do this going into this NFL season. And it's not a full-on promise, but that's sort of what my vision is right now, is to start this podcast. I did the first one in like a year last week. So stay tuned for more episodes. It's not on any podcast platforms yet, currently just on YouTube. But first off, the Steelers this season. The Steelers made the move to bring in Aaron Rodgers this offseason, which I think was a wise move. I know some people out there think Aaron Rodgers is washed. They think Aaron Rodgers doesn't have what it takes to come into Pittsburgh and potentially break through and win a playoff game, which they haven't won in a very long time. And personally for me, looking at what Aaron Rodgers did in his last season with the New York Jets, I don't think that level of play just from the entire season is going to be enough to take the Steelers on a deep playoff run. But I think that if we can see more of the vintage type Aaron Rodgers, and it doesn't have to be, 2020, 2021 MVP Aaron Rodgers, if we can just see maybe a 10%, 15% better Aaron Rodgers from his time last year with the Jets, I think there's a chance that the Steelers could win a few playoff games. But I think that it's very reliant on how Rodgers performs, because I don't think this is a very, very good offensive situation. And I was looking at the Jets situation and trying to compare it to this year's situation with the Steelers and just the weapons, the offensive line. And honestly, I think Aaron Rodgers had better weapons with the New York Jets. If you look at their receivers, he had Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams after he got traded there, and Allen Lazard. Now you look at the Steelers receivers. They have DK Metcalf, Calvin Austin III, and Roman Wilson. And in my personal opinion, I would take the Jets receivers. I just think the top two with Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, better than DK Metcalf, Calvin Austin, or even Roman Wilson. And I honestly still don't understand why the Steelers made the decision to trade away George Pickens. I guess I sort of understand, what their thought process, but it would have made much more sense in my mind, and I would be much more confident in what Rodgers could do here with Pittsburgh if they would have kept George Pickens, just because I feel like with Aaron Rodgers, where he is in his career at 41 years old, if he plays the same as he did last season with the weapons he has here, I don't think they're going to be able to get past the Ravens and teams like the Bengals, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow. And so I thought, for the period of time when they had DK Metcalf and George Pickens, you thought to yourself, like, okay, that's an interesting combination. They're similar type players. But the idea of Rodgers with both of those guys, that sort of gets me excited. But now, I just don't think they have a ton of depth at wide receiver. They do have some tight ends who are, better than average, around average. Freiermuth, they brought in Jonnu Smith as well. So I don't love the Steelers wide receiver situation. I love DK Metcalf. Outside of that, I'm a little bit on it. And then if you look at the offensive line situation, last year the Jets did have one of the better offensive lines in the NFL, just on how much pressure they were allowing. And that no doubt helped Aaron Rodgers. And I don't think Aaron Rodgers can move quite like he used to. Now that's not that he can't move around, but back in Aaron Rodgers' prime, he was moving around just as good, if not better, than Patrick Mahomes. And I really think that looking at this Steelers offensive line, I have some concerns. I think that it's worse than the Jets offensive line last year. You have a lot of young guys, a lot of guys going into year 2. And that is a major concern for me for this Steelers team because, while yes, Rodgers can move around and maneuver still, I just don't love the offensive line situation. So, honestly, I feel like Rodgers had a better situation last year with the New York Jets, just when it comes to his receiver core and his offensive line. I do think that they have some pretty good running backs with Warren, and we'll see how rookie Caleb Johnson looks. I think he has some good potential. I just don't love the situation. So that's why in my mind, for the Steelers to be able to come in and have the success they're hoping for, which of course they're playing for a Super Bowl. I mean, that's why you make a move for Aaron Rodgers. You're not playing it safe. You're sort of taking that, I don't know if it's a high risk move. You're just sort of trying to play for that upside with Aaron Rodgers, because we all know what Aaron Rodgers can be, what he's been in the past. And I think that the Steelers making this decision is them taking a chance that they could get something like that. Because if you get something anywhere close to prime Aaron Rodgers, then yes, this team can go on a deep playoff run. And I think there's a chance it happens. Now, what percent chance? I wouldn't say it's super high, 10, 20% chance. But if you look at Rodgers last year, he's coming off, a year removed last year when he started with the Jets from his Achilles injury. And now going into this year with Pittsburgh, he is one more year removed from that Achilles injury. And I think that we're going to see him play much better than he did, just when it comes to physical health-wise. Because when you're coming off an Achilles injury, of course, you're probably going to be a little bit more cognizant about how you move around. And it probably took some time for Rodgers to really get reacclimated to playing. He was off for a whole season. He's in a new situation. And I was rewatching the Week 18 game, the final Jets game against the Dolphins a few days ago. And Rodgers honestly looks really good. He had 4 touchdowns, 1 interception. The 1 interception was like a drop by the Jets, one of the Jets receivers, unfortunately. But as I was watching that game, I was thinking to myself, like, Rodgers was moving around, not like he used to completely, because, of course, he's 41 years old. He's not going to move around like he's 25, 27, 28. But he still has some of that escapability to his game. He still has that ability just to almost have just like this crazy sense for what's going on in the pocket. His pocket presence is crazy, and he can move around, maneuver, juke guys out. And that's one of the biggest parts of his game, especially early on in his career. And I was almost surprised to just see, like, Rodgers still has it. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities that we do see Rodgers closer to what we saw, not in his final year in Green Bay, because in his final year in Green Bay, he wasn't great. But some of those previous years, if he could just get to 90% of the 2020, 2021 MVP Aaron Rodgers seasons, then I do think that the Steelers have a chance to really do something special. And one other thing I was looking at, so Brett Favre, of course, similar trajectory to Aaron Rodgers, going from the Packers, then to the Jets. And then I thought for a time that Rodgers could actually make a move to the Vikings, which I did not want to see that as a Packers fan. I mean, that's the last thing I want to see is having to watch, both of my, childhood quarterbacks, Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers, go in and wear a Vikings jersey. So I was glad that didn't come to fruition. But Brett Favre, in his year with the Jets, he throws 22 touchdowns and 22 interceptions. And if after that season you're thinking to yourself, like, man, Brett Favre's going to the Vikings. Of course, he's still Brett Favre. We know how talented he was. But, 22 touchdowns, 22 interceptions is like, are we sure that Brett Favre is really, going to be able to take this Vikings team far? He comes in and takes that Vikings team to an NFC championship, throws 33 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. And so there's a chance that Rodgers could look closer to his prime self, which that's the outcome I want to see. I'm still rooting for Aaron Rodgers. I still want to see him have success because I do think he's the most talented quarterback of all time. I think he's more talented than any other quarterback. I think if he would have had the defenses Tom Brady had during his time in Green Bay, he could have won 3+ Super Bowls. And so I want to see that happen. As I said, it really comes down to Rodgers raising his level of play because I don't think his surrounding cast is really top tier. I think if he would have gone to a team like the Vikings, I'd have more confidence in what he could do, with a guy like Kevin O'Connell. But still, I think that they're going to be a competitive team. I think that the Steelers will probably be right on the fringe, sort of like they were last year, 10-7. They've lost in the playoffs, the first round for a while now. I just have a hard time being fully confident that this is a team with how they're built right now that can beat guys like Lamar and Joe Burrow. And the one thing that is a benefit that I think with Rodgers making the decision of where to go, I think he needed to choose a team that had a really, really good defense, and the Steelers have that. I think they have a top 10 defense, and they were a top 10 defense last year. And the question becomes, if you're facing Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen or, Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes in the playoffs, can Aaron Rodgers in this offense raise their level of play enough to really sort of keep up with these teams? Because it doesn't even matter. If you have a top 10 defense, good luck shutting down Lamar Jackson for all 4 quarters. So you're going to need Aaron Rodgers to really come in and play like old Aaron Rodgers. And I think that the Steelers were totally justified to take this chance on Rodgers. He has a pretty cheap deal, especially compared to a lot of quarterbacks in the NFL. And even if there was a 10% chance you could get anywhere close to prime Rodgers, you take the chance. So my guess would be they don't make a deep playoff run. Can they? Yes, if Rodgers can, play at his close to elite level. Now moving on to the Browns quarterback situation, which is interesting. Probably one of the more interesting battles of the offseason. They make the move to draft 2 quarterbacks, Dillon Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders. And it came out earlier today that Kevin Stefanski has decided to make Dillon Gabriel the QB2, which now means Shedeur will be QB3. Joe Flacco's QB1. They traded Kenny Pickett recently to the Raiders for a 6th-round pick. Raiders backup quarterback Aiden O'Connell fractured his wrist, and so they felt the need to bring in Kenny Pickett, who I think could be a fine backup quarterback. And here's the thing about this move to make Gabriel QB2. I know tons of people are upset. They want to see Shedeur as QB2. They think that the Browns are sort of out to get Shedeur. I'm not too surprised by this move because if you're the Browns and you drafted Gabriel in round 3, you then come in and draft Shedeur round 5. Obviously, you value Gabriel over Shedeur Sanders, pretty basic. But if you come in and let's say Gabriel and Shedeur in their mind are playing similar type football, just, very equal. Let's say they were, okay? Who are you going to name as the backup? When you drafted the guy in the 3rd round, are you really going to come in and take the 5th round guy who you drafted 2 rounds later, put him ahead of Gabriel if they're sort of similar? I don't think they would do that just because it's like sort of admitting that you maybe didn't have the right value, or maybe you shouldn't have taken Gabriel in round 3 if you're already trying to push Shedeur ahead of him, and then it's almost like, why'd you use a 3rd round pick on Gabriel? You could have just waited. That's sort of one thing there, but I think that Shedeur, in my mind, should be the backup. The reason is not because I think that the Browns are like sort of out to get him. I don't think that's the case. I just think that, in my mind, I think Shedeur is the better quarterback. I think that Gabriel, maybe he's a little bit safer just when it comes to, getting the ball out quick. I do know Shedeur has dealt a little bit with, some of these bad habits of drifting in the pocket and taking unnecessary sacks in the last preseason game. But in my mind, I sort of see Dillon Gabriel, more of a like system type quarterback, more like a Tua, where they can win you some games, but are they going to take you to a Super Bowl? Tua technically could. It's just hard if you don't have an elite quality quarterback to get past guys, like Josh Allen, Mahomes, all those kind of guys. And I do know that, Shedeur, he may not have the athletic traits or the speed of a Josh Allen, but I do think he has the poise and the comfortability just sort of carrying himself as a quarterback, where I really feel like he's going to end up having success here in the NFL, even though he dropped around 5, even though tons of teams passed on him, maybe for different kinds of reasons, because maybe they don't, want if you're bringing him in as a backup, I get not wanting to have the whole media storm that comes with Shedeur just because of, how talked about they are. It brings a lot of media, brings a lot of attention, and you can see it now with the Browns. They're getting questioned about this all the time, and there are assumptions made that the Browns just are somehow out to get Shedeur, which I don't think is the case because they drafted him. I don't think they want to see him fail, but I do think that Shedeur is the better quarterback. And looking at that preseason game, the last preseason game, Gabriel goes in and he played pretty good. He had a lot of, nice quick passes. He's a lot of zip on the ball, made some really nice throws, had some really poor throws as well, was somewhat inconsistent at times. And then when Shedeur goes in, the offensive line couldn't block anything. I mean, guys were just breaking through the offensive line, and so Shedeur's just trying to make a play happen. He's trying to break away, do something special, and I do feel like he's going to learn at some point not to do things like that. It's similar to Caleb Williams, who during his time in college, he could, because of his speed and because of the athletes he was playing, a lot of times he could get away with just running backwards, running around. But in the NFL, I think as Caleb Williams has started to learn, we'll see if he can break the bad habit. You cannot get away with what you used to get away with in college just because the talent is so much higher. Just the average NFL player is so much faster than the average, college defensive lineman. And so there's no doubt Shedeur needs to get better in that area. But even on his first play, Shedeur just sort of running around the pocket, throws a beautiful pass. He's just going to be a better quarterback in my opinion. I don't think the Browns see it that way necessarily. And it makes me wonder what's going to happen here in Cleveland because, Joe Burrow, not the long-term answer. He's 40-ish years old. And so I honestly think the best case scenario for Shedeur may be for Dillon Gabriel to win the job just because, the Browns, let's look at their, history and what's happened since 2000. They've made the playoffs 3 different times. And I think that if Dillon Gabriel were to win this job, let's say at the end of this year and going into this next season, 2026, maybe there's a team out there that maybe either has an older quarterback or a team that is willing to take a chance on Shedeur. Let's say, for example, if Matthew Stafford were to decide to retire. I think he's 37. He could play longer. He's had some back injury issues. I don't know how long that's going to affect him. But if a team like the Rams were to say, okay, if Stafford were to retire, someone like them would make perfect sense for Shedeur because I feel like Shedeur would be much better off with Sean McVay than just the whole situation in Cleveland. They just haven't found success, and I don't really trust the Browns, to be honest. And I think something like that could happen, and that could honestly end up working out better for Shedeur. It just feels like at some point in the next year or two, he should get an opportunity to start. And I feel like if the Browns go with Gabriel eventually, that Shedeur could potentially go elsewhere. So all in all, I think it's a mistake to name Gabriel a QB2 just because I think Shedeur is a better player. I think he's going to be a better player, and we'll sort of keep an eye on that and sort of see if that progresses, moving forward. And then now I want to address the Trey Hendrickson situation. I don't know if you saw, but Hendrickson, the news came out that Hendrickson will be getting, according to Adam Schefter, a $14 million raise for this season, boosting his 2025 salary to $30 million. And so he was in the final year of his deal. He was trying to get a long-term extension done with the Cincinnati Bengals, and they weren't able to come to a long-term extension. So it's just a deal that raises his pay in 2025, and then now he is going to become an unrestricted free agent after the season. So they'll have to deal with this whole situation once again. And Albert Breer of Sports Illustrated noted that the Bengals can franchise tag him after the season. Here's sort of what I'm thinking with this whole situation with the Bengals and just what they've done this offseason. I think they made a mistake by deciding to extend T. Higgins to a multi-year deal before deciding to lock up Hendrickson for a long-term deal. The reason being, T. Higgins is your wide receiver 2. He has missed 5 games each of the past 2 seasons. And you compare that to Hendrickson, he led the league in sacks last year, one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. He has started in 17 games each of the past 2 years, has not missed a game. And I understand he is older. He's 30 years old currently. And, T. Higgins, is in his mid-20s. What is he, 25, 26, 27, somewhere around there. I just think that for a Bengals team, that their issue has been the past couple of seasons, especially last year, their defense was absolutely atrocious, even with Trey Hendrickson. And so I think it's good for them that they at least got Hendrickson to stay, because trading him away, you would have needed to have Joe Burrow put up 50 points a game to try to win with that defense. And they do have a few young players they drafted. We'll see if they develop and can put in any good play in their first season. So at least he's here for 2025. But I think what they should have done is tag T. Higgins and trade him away, get some draft capital in return. You'd still have Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase. I'm totally fine with the extension for Jamar Chase. I just think it's too much to pay a wide receiver too, even though this is nothing against T. Higgins. I think he's a very, very good player. I think he's worth the money he got. I just think that investing that much money in the wide receiver position is a massive mistake. And then I think they should have drafted a receiver round 1 or 2. And wide receivers just produce much more quickly than edge rushers typically in the NFL, just because of, all these guys playing 7-on-7 growing up. There's so many talented receivers that can come in and play good football. And I feel like it's much harder to find an elite pass rusher than it is to find an elite wide receiver. There's so many talented wide receivers these days. And when you have someone like Joe Burrow, he is going to elevate the play no matter who is in there. So even if T. Higgins wasn't in there, name any receiver, Joe Burrow is going to elevate the play of that player, and the offense will still, I think, play at a pretty high level. So that's where just looking at the team makeup, I just think that it's going to be difficult for them after this season if they lose Trey Hendrickson and let's say Shamar Stewart doesn't develop after year 1 and isn't playing top-tier football. It's just going to be tough to have a defense that's playing so poorly. And if we look back at the Bengals in the year when they go to the Super Bowl back in 2021, they were third in defensive spending at $95.25 million. And, at that time, they had Joe Burrow on his rookie deal, which is obviously much cheaper when you're not having to pay a guy, $55+ million. And when you're not having to pay that quarterback that much, they were able to spend up on the defense. And it's like no wonder they go to a Super Bowl that season because, it's sort of how their team makeup was. And sort of like the Commanders this year, they're able to spend up in other areas because they're not having to pay Jaden Daniels a ton of money. When you have other teams having to pay quarterbacks $50+ million, you have to start being smarter with your money and figuring out exactly where you want to put it. So just my overall take about this whole situation with the Bengals, it's awesome that they got Trey Hendrickson to stay this season. I think that's great. They needed to have that happen. They should not have traded him away. But I just think that they should have prioritized their edge rusher. And I think, yes, he's older, but I think edge rushers end up playing longer typically. So I think you could have gotten a few more years out of him. And I think just sort of solidifying that instead of T. Higgins, I just think it's a smarter move in my opinion. So that's sort of my take on that whole situation there. And now to end it off with the Dallas Cowboys, who are always talked about because they love to make noise in the media. And this Micah Parsons situation has totally made a ton of noise. At the same time, we have the Jerry Jones, Cowboys 90s documentary come out. I've watched a few of those. It's very interesting. I feel like it gives you a lot of insight into Jerry Jones and sort of his whole thought process and things like that. But we are currently 9 days away from the Dallas Cowboys' first game the day I'm making this podcast/video. And still nothing is done with Micah Parsons. And it sounds like Jerry Jones is totally fine with paying Micah Parsons a ton of money. And he was even sharing on a podcast with Michael Irvin that Jerry Jones has already offered Micah Parsons a deal which, quote, would have made the highest paid guarantee player, made Parsons the highest paid guarantee player other than a QB in the NFL. That was a quote, would have made him the highest paid guarantee player other than a QB in the NFL from Jerry Jones. And so Myles Garrett, also edge rusher like Micah Parsons, got a guaranteed $123.5 million. So if what Jerry is saying is true, which I assume, I don't know why he would, lie in that situation. I assume he's telling the truth here. He's willing to give Parsons more than $123.5 million guaranteed. And so it sounds like in my mind, that's a great deal. If I'm Micah Parsons and, I'm trying to get a big deal done, I feel like that's something that he'd probably be wanting to go for just because of typically these NFL contracts, they end up jumping the next guy. And so it sounds like a reasonable deal. The whole issue seems to be Jerry not wanting to have the agent involved and Micah Parsons wanting to have the agent involved. And it sounds like Jerry, like back in, March or April, they were, having a discussion with each other. Micah Parsons didn't really realize it was a negotiation. Jerry sort of saw it as a negotiation. And now Jerry's basically stuck on what they had discussed when it comes to the guarantees, when it comes to the years. And Jerry said with Michael Irvin that, he's okay if the agent wants to, finish up the paperwork, but the money, years, guarantees have been negotiated. So Jerry does not want to go through another negotiation, but it sounds like Micah wants his agent to negotiate for him. And so the question becomes, is this going to get done in the next 9 days? My guess, which has been my assumption this whole time, is that it's going to get done right before the season, just because when you have a player of this caliber, Jerry Jones clearly is willing to pay him this kind of money. And if you're Micah Parsons, it's not like Micah Parsons has a leverage here. It's not like he can just sort of have his way because, he can just come in here and sort of say, hey, Jerry, this is what I want, or I'm not going to play. Because if Micah Parsons does not play, he is going to be out a ton of money. He will lose more than $1 million per game if he sits out. And if Micah Parsons at this point had been willing to sit out practice in preseason games, I'd say, okay, maybe he's actually willing to take the chance of missing real-life game action and really putting pressure on Jerry Jones. But Micah Parsons has been showing up to practice. He's been showing up to the preseason games, even if he doesn't necessarily want to be there. He has not been willing to forfeit that money and take those kind of fines. So I have no reason to believe, from what Micah Parsons has shown so far, that he'd all of a sudden come in and say, you know what, I'm going to miss out on $1 million this game, even though I wasn't willing to lose $40,000 each day at practice. So I'm not convinced Micah Parsons is willing to take it as far as sitting out games. And so that's why I think this deal will get done right before the season. And this is something that happened last year with Jerry Jones. This has gotten blown up a lot bigger just because Micah Parsons, goes public on August 1st, demands a trade, says he wants to leave. I don't think he wants to leave Dallas. I think it's just a negotiation tactic. And I feel like the more that these NFL players demand trades, it makes demanding a trade less of a real threat to these teams, just because it's like, okay, you don't really want to trade. You're just trying to figure out how you can sort of push the negotiation to the next step. We saw Myles Garrett early this year say he wants to go somewhere and win. And so he, requested a trade. And you know what, a little later, he gets his, $40+ million. What do you know? He's fine playing for a losing team. He wanted to go to a place that won, changed his mind with the $40+ million. And it just seems to be a way that these guys are trying to use it. I mean, we saw it with Terry McLaurin as well. They're trying to use it as a tactic. So I don't think Micah Parsons wants to leave Dallas. And so that's why I think this will end up getting done. And Dak Prescott was even asked about it in the past couple of days and said this asked if Parsons will play in the opener. He said, I've got confidence. I told y'all that way back when, and I'm just going off experience, honestly. No different than mine. I've got confidence in that. Just hoping, which I know he is, that he's ready to play. And Schottenheimer said earlier, I think August 20th, that he said, quote, we feel like Micah is going to be out there week 1. So this whole time, I felt like it's just a lot of noise, and I feel like Jerry's going to end up getting this done with Micah Parsons. And one other thing that Jerry Jones did bring up that I thought was interesting was that a lot of people get on Jerry Jones because he doesn't like to get these contracts done sooner. And because he waits, let's say, an extra year, he has to pay him an extra, $5 to $10 million just because other players end up getting the deal, the salary cap rises, and so he has to pay him more money. And he brought up a very good point that I don't think is, talked about enough. And he was sort of talking about the injury risk. And sometimes because he's waiting on getting these deals done, he's sort of potentially saving the Cowboys a lot of money if these players were to, injure themselves. Because I'm pretty sure it's 2 different offensive linemen. I'm pretty sure they're both offensive linemen. They just suffered, season-ending injuries, and they'd both just gotten massive deals. And so on the one hand, people say, oh, look, players should sit out until they get their money because, look, they could end up getting injured. But at the same time, if you're an organization and you just pay a guy $100+ million and now they're going to miss the whole season, I could see if you're Jerry Jones, if you said, you know what, I'm just going to wait as long as possible because the longer I wait, the less risk I have. Let's say Micah Parsons had done an extension last offseason. If he got injured during that season, then Jerry's already going to have to pay him, where he didn't have him under contract. If he would have had a massive, injury, that was potentially impacting his future, then it gives you a little more leeway. So I sort of get that. It's like almost like he's sort of saving himself some potential risk of guys getting injured. Of course, once you do the deal, then of course you run the risk of the player getting injured. But you may save yourself a little bit in certain situations. So we'll see what happens here. If you guys want to see more of these in the future, feel free to subscribe. If you enjoyed it, you have other friends who like the NFL, feel free to share it if you would like. But I appreciate you guys watching. I have a Twitter as well where I share some thoughts there at LukeBeller3 on Twitter. But that's it for this one, and I'll see you guys next time.